Anton Bruckner really isn't known for having followers or for spawning a compositional school of thought. Well, except for this guy. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Richard Wetz. Richard Wetz was born in what is now southern Poland in February 1875. He only became interested in music when he was 8, but by the time he was a teenager, he knew that he was hooked, and that would be his life. We actually don't know that much about Wetz's personal life because sources on him are few and far between. I usually like to find juicy academic sources for these videos, but no dice this time. True to the promise he made to himself to spend his life in music, he left his hometown at age 23, bound for the Leipzig Conservatory, but he found their model of study all too restrictive, and he dropped out after less than 2 months. So instead of studying music at their conservatory, he studied privately in Leipzig, as well as taking classes at the university, which introduced him to subjects that went beyond music. This was a stroke of luck for him in the long term, because if he'd simply studied at the conservatory in Leipzig, he wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to the kinds of philosophy and psychology and poetry that he learned at the university. In particular, this is where he encountered the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who was also a major influence on the works of Richard Wagner. Around the turn of the century, Wetz was peripatetic, going all the way around German-speaking lands, either studying or working odd musical jobs, until 1906, when he landed in Erfurt, in modern-day central Germany, and was appointed the director of their local music association. This might have just been one odd job in a line of odd jobs, except for the fact that he fell in love with Erfurt and decided to stay there for the rest of his life. Now, at the age of 31, he finally had the stability to commit himself to writing more extensive music. Within a couple of years of his time in Erfurt, if you wanted a conductor, Wetz was the man. If you wanted a composer, Wetz was the man. If you wanted a musicology lesson, Wetz was the man. I keep saying the man. Eventually, he was hired as a professor in nearby Weimar, but he was still too much of a homebody to leave Erfurt. It was in this period, where he had duties both in Erfurt and Weimar, where he began producing symphonies. He wrote 3 symphonies in 6 years, and then never wrote another one. He also wrote 2 string quartets contemporaneous with the symphonies, and then never wrote another one, although sketches for a 4th symphony and a 3rd string quartet were both found after his death. This is where his association with Anton Bruckner comes in. His symphonies are often categorized as being in the vein of Anton Bruckner, an extension of the elder Austrian's style, after Bruckner's death, obviously. But is it really fair to categorize Wetz as a purely symphonic composer when he just wrote 3 symphonies, and the number of symphonies that he produced is dwarfed by the sheer number of pieces he wrote in all of these other genres? I mean, just in vocal music alone, not only did he write choral orchestral pieces, 2 operas, which we're going to get to in a second, but just in the realm of the art song, he wrote over 100 of them. 3 symphonies, 100 art songs. Is it really fair to call him Brucknerian when the only Brucknerian thing about his works is just found in the symphonies? Well, maybe, if only because the symphonies are the most widely known of this obscure composer's works. I want to point out that Wetz's output is significantly more diverse than Bruckner's, in terms of the genres in which they worked. Yet while Bruckner was a major influence, he wasn't Wetz's only influence. If you listen carefully to a Wetz symphony, you can hear hints of Brahms or even Schumann stuck in there. This is where Wetz's only producing 3 symphonies hurts him more than it helps him. See, most symphonic composers take a few tries before they find their voice. This is why that writing a truly excellent first symphony is a grueling undertaking, because you just don't have the experience and the form that other composers do. This is why Beethoven's first is a perfectly fine piece, but it's more Haydn-esque. The Beethoven of Beethoven's first is not the Beethoven of Beethoven 3 or 5 or 9. So along that line of reasoning, if Wetz had produced more symphonies, it's likely that his style would have developed significantly beyond the shadow of Bruckner, and this appellation of just being Bruckner-esque would only be applicable to the first few symphonies, and he might have ended up better known. But the question remains, what exactly makes Wetz's symphonies so Brucknerian in the first place? we'll look no further than the First Symphony, where there's a lot of sequential development and an over-reliance on the grand pause, both of which are stereotypical Brucknerian traits. Yet there are links between Wetz and Bruckner that go beyond merely symphonic tendencies. Both were composers who started writing their major works in their middle age. Both were composers largely of choral music, which has been neglected in favor of their symphonies, which in both cases constitute a much slimmer part of their output, if you think of it as a pie chart. And both were composers who had trouble getting recognition during their lifetimes because they were thought of as being provincial. In Wetz's case, he actually lived out in the countryside. In Bruckner's case, even though he lived in Vienna, he was considered a simpleton. On one hand, to say that Wetz was only Brucknerian is to take into account only his symphonies. On the other hand, those pieces were definitely Bruckner-influenced. And don't just take the critics' words for it, take Wetz's own words for it. He once wrote that he could no longer speak of Bruckner because he couldn't find the words to describe how great and sublime he held Bruckner's art. Wetz's choral music is perhaps his greatest achievement. His Requiem is more effective as a choral symphony than it is as a liturgical piece. Although to be fair, that goes for a lot of Requiems. As we all know, if you put a choir and orchestra together, I'm gonna be a sucker for it. Speaking of vocal music, Wetz's versatility as an artist, and perhaps a bit of Wagnerianism as filtered through Bruckner, was showcased in the fact that he didn't just write two operas, he also wrote their libretti. These two, Judith and The Eternal Fire, are basically lost to history. I can't find any evidence of a modern-day staging, but they seem like interesting pieces. Judith, as far as I can tell, is based off of the apocryphal biblical book of the same name, while The Eternal Fire is set in this vague, ancient, polytheistic Germany that's reminiscent of the setting of Wagner's Ring Cycle. Wetz resigned his official Erfurt post in 1925, but still continued to live there even though he was still teaching in Weimar. For a short time, he was even active in Berlin, as he'd been elected to the Berlin Academy of the Arts, but he was just too much of a homebody to stay away for that long. Like many Germans, Wetz fell prey to hyper-nationalistic sentiments in the years following World War I. They rightfully felt that the terms of their surrender in that conflict were far too harsh, and the long-term social and economic stability of the weakened German state was in serious doubt. At the risk of vast oversimplification, it was this socioeconomic state which, combined with already present anti-Semitism in Central Europe, led to the scapegoating of Jews, which in turn led to the rise of the Nazi Party. Wetz joined the Nazi Party in May 1933, but did not live long under the Third Reich. His smoking habit gave him a bronchial infection, which killed him in January 1935 at the age of 59. We're going to get into the details of his joining the party in just a bit. Suffice it to say that it's not exactly what you think, so reserve your judgment. Wetz had always had issues of getting performances of his works, especially second performances. "My music is odd," he once said later in life. "When it sounds, it grabs hold of the deepest, but it rarely gets that opportunity." During his life, his affection for Erfurt, not a major musical city, was both his primary source of inspiration, as he said he could never compose if he didn't have solitude, and the primary reason why he wasn't better known in the German-speaking world. Even more avant-garde contemporaries, like Arnold Schoenberg, got more widespread recognition, while Wetz had a hard time just getting over the hump of achieving a certain amount of notability outside Erfurt. Of course, Wetz didn't have to stay in Erfurt. Moving to Leipzig or Vienna would have been a better career move, but because he loved Erfurt so much, and Erfurt was the reason that he composed what he composed, by his own admission, there's no guarantee that if he'd moved to one of those cities that he'd have written anything. To be fair, he did achieve a certain amount of notability in his lifetime in certain circles, but he was still, in relative terms, obscure. And this situation wasn't helped after World War II concluded. Denazification meant that anyone associated with the party was shunned, and Wetz was no exception because he had joined the Nazis. This ignores the facts that there are legitimate reasons, purely from an opportunistic perspective, that an artist like Wetz would want to join the Nazis. Germany had transformed overnight into a totalitarian state, and joining the party meant gaining access to certain things that you wouldn't get if you didn't join. If you stayed in good graces with the authorities, you could attain civil posts and even get commissions. I want to make it clear that there is no evidence that Wetz agreed with the excesses that typified the regime, and there is no evidence that Wetz held any sort of anti-Semitic sentiments or views. As in the case of Richard Strauss's affiliation with the Nazis, the more complex reasons why artists would join the party or collaborate with them, especially early on, are often ignored, even if the artists in question didn't feel like they had a real choice in the matter. This is where his symphony's affiliation with Bruckner hurt him much more than it helped him. You see, the Nazis loved Wetz's music precisely because it was so Brucknerian, and the Nazis had adopted Bruckner as their resident symphonist, despite the fact that Bruckner had been dead for over 3 decades before the Nazis came to power. After all, it's easy to lionize someone when they're dead, and especially in the case of Bruckner, because he didn't have any family to object. All told, I think it's fair to say that Wetz occupies a really strange position in music history. Long associated as being a singular disciple of a composer who was not known for having disciples, he was an expression of a conservative romanticism that all but died out during his lifetime. While Strauss was busying himself writing these bold, nearly atonal operas, and Arnold Schoenberg and his followers were devoted to breaking the rules of tonality altogether, Wetz was diligently working at the end of a line of tonal, romantic, symphonic composers who diligently worked out their ideas in orchestral garb. It's only been since the 1990s that his music has been more widely known and recorded and promulgated to the general public, and opinions are still split. This isn't a new thing either. Critics in his time were also split. A review of his Kleist Overture in 1908 saw a criticism for Wetz's lack of inventiveness. A few years later, down the road, he writes his Opus 42 Piano Variations, and that piece is lauded. The ascendant star of Wetz captured the beauty of craft and a finely tuned sense of development. In one sense, he was a pure example of the Teutonic ideal, unencumbered with the sounds and the styles developing outside the German-speaking world. His works, and the reason that they've been neglected, are, ironically, 2 sides of the same coin.